Getting a quality dinner on the table every night doesn't have to be so hard. Freshly chefs send you delicious, freshly prepared meals so you can eat better without any of the work. No cooking or cleanup required. Delivered to your door fresh, the meals are ready when you are. Try Freshly and you'll see what it's like to put zero effort into making dinner. Go to freshly.com/podcast to get $25 off your first order of 6 meals. That's $25 off plus free shipping at freshly.com/podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Week Ahead on Economist Radio. I'm Daniel Franklin, the executive editor at The Economist. And coming up, I interview Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ahead of the G7 summit in Quebec.
We're all facing the same challenge, which is how do we create growth in a way that includes everyone?
And The Economist has developed a new statistical model to identify what makes a country good at football.
Our model thinks that Germany should be by far and away the best team in world football. And they've only been very, very good instead of exceptionally good.
But first, on June the 12th, President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un are scheduled for their historic summit on Singapore's Sentosa Island. To discuss this and the long-term effects of Donald Trump's foreign policy, I'm joined in the studio by Edward Carr, The Economist's deputy editor. What are the chances of a deal being done in Singapore on June the 12th?
Well, of course, it's been an on-again, off-again summit, so there's something inherently unpredictable about all this. But I think at this point, both leaders are heavily invested in some sort of outcome. If by a deal you mean complete and verifiable disarmament, I think that is vanishingly unlikely. This is a hugely complicated process. North Korea has in the past promised to denuclearize and has broken its promises. So any deal has to be equipped with a big infrastructure of checking, verification. That's not going to happen. I think something else might happen, though, which is that both of them declare some sort of victory, come up with some sort of grand statement about working towards a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, possibly the reduction of troop numbers of American based in South Korea, possibly also a formal end to the Korean War. Any of these things are possible, and I think both leaders will want to claim a grand diplomatic victory.
But there are dangers in that, and what the short-term win might be proclaimed, but what are the long-term potential downsides?
I think they're quite large. The dangers are that North Korea has a pattern of making promises and then just casually walking away from them. It's done repeatedly. The dangers are also that Mr. Trump gains some sort of promise that clearly makes the United States safer by, for instance, North Korea agreeing to forego its intercontinental ballistic missiles, but that wouldn't make America's allies safer, Japan and South Korea, which would still be in the range of North Korean nukes. And that, I think, would actually be quite a dangerous sign because it would signal to America's allies that they couldn't depend upon it. That might be destabilizing in the long run, even if you have a short-term deal.
So that leads into the broader question of Donald Trump's foreign policy. We have on our cover of The Economist this week President Trump on a wrecking ball. So is he actually in danger of destroying a lot of the international order that has actually served America and the world very well for decades?
This order that you speak of is built on a series of institutions, alliances, norms of behavior and values, like liberal values like human rights. And the striking thing about Donald Trump, unlike other American post-war presidents, is that he doesn't seem to put much value in any of these things. Of course, American presidents have used naked American power repeatedly. Why wouldn't they? America's been the most powerful nation for decades. It's natural that they use power to get their way. But they've done so by clothing their actions in the rhetoric of global good, of helping the world get better, in acting through allies, and of generally supporting the notion of liberal human rights and liberal values. So Donald Trump scorns these. He treats these as if they are not only not worth very much, but actually for wimps. And that's because he seems to treat his engagements abroad as a series of lose or win negotiations. The idea that both sides might win doesn't seem to strike him very powerfully. And the truth is that if you don't regard the things you're giving up as very valuable, then you give them away too cheaply.
So there have been two very big recent examples of what you're talking about. One is the Iran deal, which Donald Trump has walked away from, upsetting his allies. And the other is trade, where there's a huge row now over tariffs that America has slapped on Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. So where does this leave relations on these crucial fronts, particularly at a time when the G7 is about to meet and the West normally tries to present a united front, but it seems more divided perhaps than a long time?
It is divided. I think there's slightly different answers for the security side that you raise with the Iran deal and the economic side that you raise with trade. On the security side, fundamentally, these alliances like NATO and the alliance between, say, Japan and the United States, these are strong and durable. And if there's a genuine threat to either country, I think those alliances will survive. But at the margins, I think they become weaker. For instance, in Asia, America's allies, if they feel they can't necessarily depend on it, they will accelerate their build-up of arms. That acquires a momentum of its own. And in Europe, for instance, I think American appeals to act against Russia with sanctions, all the voices that are ranged against that we know exist, those voices get more traction when the general trust in the security alliance is diminished. The other side is the economic alliance and the economic institutions, which chiefly work through institutions like the World Trade Organization or NAFTA. And here I think the damage is much more evident. And there's palpable anger. You now have the Europeans talking about retaliatory sanctions against the United States, as are Mexico, has already said it will put them in, and Canada. And this can require a momentum of its own and be really destructive. So I think that you may have foreign policy victories under the Trump watch, but underneath it, the fabric that has held together the world is gradually being worn out and being made more threadbare.
Ed Carr, thank you very much. You're listening to The Week Ahead from The Economist. Now, leaders of the world's wealthiest nations will meet later today in a small Canadian tourist town in Quebec. Canada, which hosts the G7 presidency this year, will welcome leaders of Italy, France, Germany, Britain, Japan, and this will be President Trump's first visit to his northern neighbour since becoming president. He may get a frosty reception amid an escalating row over trade. Recently, before the trade war escalated, I went to Ottawa and met Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, in his office. I asked him if the G7 is in danger of becoming the G6+1.
I think one of the things that people overlook is the 7 most advanced economies and, quite frankly, the West and the world in general, is we're facing a similar problem. We're all facing the same challenge, which is how do we create growth in a way that includes everyone, that includes the middle class and those working hard to join it. We have a situation where economic anxiety, worries about the future, worries about your kids' future, worries about whether or how you're going to retire, worries about the technological changes, worries about disruptions in globalization and global trade are hitting our citizens, particularly in the G7 nations, pretty hard. And all of us, from Donald Trump to me to the other leaders, have all been elected on, in one way or another, a commitment to make the economy work for everyone, not just for the few, not just for the wealthy. Now, the policy prescriptions obviously are different in different places, but that challenge is at the core of what we are each facing internally and what we are facing as a world. And that is really the G7 being fundamentally an economic gathering. That is at the core of the discussions we're going to be having in Charlevoix.
But nevertheless, these differences have become more apparent. And there is a challenge, I think, to keep the sense that the unity of purpose is there in this vital group. So what are you finding as you prepare for this, the toughest in that respect?
Well, I think just to highlight that, I mean, obviously, my political philosophy and approach to a number of different problems is, as a number of people have highlighted, a marked contrast from the approach that the President of the United States takes on many of the similar problems. And yet, we find ourselves, because of geography and because of renegotiations of NAFTA, in regular contact on issues that matter to both of us. And they're almost always issues of the economy, issues of how to make our middle classes successful, how to bring the people who entrusted us with the responsibility of building an economy that actually includes everyone and that brings back people who feel like they were left out of it. And we find common ground on those challenges. We find ways, as we negotiate, as we look for ways to collaborate domestically, but also with the international community, with a focus on, is this going to help our workers, our citizens? And the one thing that is very clear is it's not a zero-sum game. And that focus on where we agree and where we can be mutually reinforcing in our pathways towards success that includes everyone is the focus of the G7.
Let's turn to the relationship with the United States, which is the crucial relationship for Canada. A huge percentage of your trade is with the United States. Maybe a fifth of your economy is dependent on the United States. How do you manage the relationship with Donald Trump?
Canadians expect and have expected from the very beginning two things of me, and quite frankly, they expect that of any Canadian Prime Minister and any American President. First of all, have a constructive, positive relationship in which we can, talk on a broad range of issues that matter to us, very rapidly, that we have a very good working relationship because obviously we are each other's, closest neighbors and best allies. But secondly, Canadians also expect and have always expected that their Prime Minister stands up for Canadian interests, Canadian values, Canadian solutions, and not just be an extension of the United States. And those two elements could seem somewhat at odds with this particular confluence of Prime Minister and President. But the fact is, I have a very good working relationship with the President, and he understands that my job is to stand up for Canadian interests, and he doesn't take that as an attack or an issue. It's exactly what he would expect me to be doing, and he is not dismayed when I'm very firm that I'm going to only make sure that things that happen are in Canada's
interest. So can you give
interests.
some examples of that firmness and how you've handled that, where you've had to be?
Well, a great example are the ongoing negotiations on NAFTA. We are looking to update and modernize and renew our North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And they have put some proposals forward that we have simply said, we will not accept these proposals. A perfect example is this idea of a sunset clause on a trade deal. I mean, having a trade deal that terminates unless it is actively renewed every 5 years is simply not a trade deal at all. And we've been very clear, however much the United States wants it, it is not true that a bad deal is better than no deal. I have said very clearly, no deal is better than a bad deal, and we will be very firm on that.
So when President Trump, as he did just recently, calls Canada very difficult to deal with, very spoiled, do you take that as a compliment?
I take that as an expression that he understands that we are standing up for our interests and not allowing ourselves to be intimidated by the difference in scale between our economies.
So turning to a different topic, here at The Economist we have a season called Open Future, which is on remaking the case for classical liberal values for the 21st century. And sometimes Canada is seen as something of a model or something of a champion in that respect. Do you take to that a view of how to go about this? Because there's a lot of resistance, there's a lot of opposition. Part of the point of what we're doing is precisely because these liberal values are under threat in so many parts of the world right now. What can you do as a country to pursue this sort of agenda while protecting those who are left behind?
Well, I think the element to understand is those aren't two separate factors. Those are extremely linked. The fact that there are people being left aside, left out, or worried that they're being left out, and the faltering of the model that has worked reasonably well in the West over the past decades are linked. When people get told that we'll invest in infrastructure, in education, in science, in trade competitiveness, in trade deals, in tax competitiveness, and everyone will benefit from the fruits of those pro-growth strategies, and people sort of realize that, wow, the wealthiest are getting wealthier, but the middle class and those working hard to join it are not doing very well or haven't gotten a raise in 30 years. There's something wrong with the system. So what we did, and Canada's no different. I mean, people are sort of holding up Canada as some special place. We're pretty special, but we're not different from anywhere else. We're facing the same kinds of politics of division, politics of nationalism, of nativism, of worries about trade, of anti-globalization that you see elsewhere. And what we did in my election 2.5 years ago was very much focus on saying, okay, we hear that anxiety. Instead of augmenting it for political gains in the short term, we're going to focus on allaying it. So first thing we did was lower taxes for the middle class, raise them on the wealthiest 1%. We then gave a very generous child benefit to low and middle income families, stopped sending them to wealthier families. We're investing in infrastructure, whether it's green infrastructure or public transit or public housing, things that are reassuring people that we're on the right track. At the same time as we're doing that, we are investing massively in things like AI, in science, in pure and applied research, in STEM education, in retraining for people in the job market so that people are not worried about the future, but see the future as an opportunity. All those things together have actually led us to having the strongest growth rates in the G7 in 2017. People are confident about where we're going. We've got lowest unemployment in 40 years. Things are going well in Canada because we're bringing people along and trying to allay those fears.
Let's hone in on a couple where getting the balance right is far from simple. So immigration, for example, one of the areas where the backlash can be strongest, and you've had difficulties, I think, of people coming across the border from the United States. So how do you get that balance right?
Well, irregular migration is indeed something that is of concern in our sort of political and in citizens' minds right now. And what we are focusing on is protecting that incredibly precious resource that Canadians are generally very positively inclined towards immigration. And even the debate around irregular arrivals is more that they are challenging our system and making it more difficult to bring in regular immigrants. And that's something that people are worried about, that there's some backdoor into our immigration system. So what our focus is on, and what we are very much doing, is reassuring Canadians by demonstrating that this is not an extra load on our system, but it's not breaking our system. It's not straining our system. Everyone who arrives, whether it's irregular or regular, will be processed rigorously. And if they are coming across the border claiming refugee status, and it turns out they're not refugees, they're not fleeing violence or persecution or war or terror, they will eventually be sent home to their countries, because it's not a shortcut into Canada. And getting that message out there, saying, yes, we accept over 300,000 immigrants a year, almost 1% of our population every year. We're going to continue to be open and welcoming, but we will do it in the rules-based system that is deeply reassuring to Canadians, and on the other side, allows us to ensure success for those new arrivals on integration and on finding jobs.
Do you think you sent a too open message that encouraged more people to come to Canada that's created a problem for you?
I think highlighting that Canada will always be an open country, highlighting that we are signatories to UN conventions that mean that we have to accept refugees or process asylum claims, is simply a repetition and a reinforcement of our values, and sending that message as well that we are going to continue to be a country of laws that applies our rules and our system rigorously. Does not contradict anything.
So another example of where these things can be tricky is the gender pronouns. You pass very progressive legislation, but then you hit a problem of accusations that this is an inhibition on free speech. So again, do you find the line tricky to draw between?
No, that's actually not a thing. What you're describing isn't something that is of any substance at all. We haven't legislated free speech on gender pronouns or anything like that. That's a right-wing chimera that they've tried to stir up. What we are making a very significant argument around is that inclusion of women in the workforce and women in success, empowerment of marginalized women and girls, combating gender violence are all very much the right things to do, but they're also very smart things to do. That it's an economic argument of inclusion and equality and pay equity. We know that the growth in our economies over the past few decades has largely, or in a large part, come from the joining of strong, successful women into our workforce. But there's still a gap in success in achieving potential. If we close that gap, that's going to be a place that new growth is coming from. And everyone knows we're looking for new places to develop growth.
Final question, back to the G7, 600 million Canadian dollars or so. Is that money well spent?
Absolutely. I think it's an investment in not just bringing leaders together, but demonstrating to our citizens that our countries are working together on the big issues that matter, whether it's on gender, whether it's on environment, or mostly on this shared challenge of how do we create growth that works for everyone. And I think that's both reassuring to people to see people coming together and working on the things that matter to them. And the outcomes and the solutions that we're going to be putting forward are also going to be very much worth it.
Justin Trudeau, thank you.
Real pleasure.
You can find a full transcript of that interview at economist.com/openfuture. Finally, on June the 14th, the World Cup kicks off in Russia with 32 nations competing to win football's greatest prize. What does it take for a country to become a football superpower? Well, here at The Economist, we've built a statistical model to try to find out the underlying sporting and economic factors that determine a country's footballing potential. To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by James Tozer, a data journalist at The Economist. Hello, James.
Hi, Daniel.
Now, first, can you tell me and the listeners a bit about your model?
What we were trying to do was work out what makes a country good at football, the very basic underlying factors. The first thing we looked at was economics. Football is full of rags to riches stories, but it's much harder to develop if you're in a very poor country, so we included GDP per capita. Next, we wanted to estimate how popular the game is in each country, because that's obviously a massive determinant in how many people will play it. So we used some estimates of participation rates from FIFA that were collected in 2006, and then we looked also at the amount of people searching for football on Google, which allowed us to look right across the world and is a very nice different way of looking at the interest in the sport. And that threw up some really interesting examples. There's a lot of interest in Africa, not so much in South Asia and in North America. And the final thing that we looked at was Olympic success as a kind of proxy for how interested a country is in sport and how much it spends on developing elite athletes. And all told, those variables, when put together, explained about 40% of the variance between how countries perform in the long term, their average goal difference across 28 years from 1990 to 2018. And what we wanted to do next was to look at the outliers and try and explain why some countries were able to overperform relative to their benchmark for so long.
So what is the real insight that this yields? I mean, famously, it's said that football involves 22 players kicking a ball around for 90 minutes and in the end Germany always wins. I mean, that's did you go much beyond that?
Well, what we discovered actually, funnily enough, was that Germany had underachieved over the very long term. Now, that will be surprising certainly to most football fans, given they're the reigning world champions. But our model thinks that Germany should be by far and away the best team in world football. It's a rich country. It doesn't have many other competing sports. It has great sporting infrastructure. And they've only been very, very good instead of exceptionally good. But one of the things we learned from looking at Germany is they've improved substantially over the period, and they're actually an embodiment of many of the policy lessons that we took from our model that countries can look to copy if they want to improve.
So what does this mean for the other end of the spectrum, the giant countries that have underperformed? I mean, China is the obvious example. Huge place, rising power. President Xi Jinping seems to be obsessed by making China a footballing superpower, spending vast amounts of money on investing in. Does the model suggest that that's a forlorn aim?
So again, another really counterintuitive thing that the model pulls out is that actually China have overperformed. People look at China and assume that because it's a massive country, it has 1.3 billion people, it ought to be better at football. But historically, very few people have played at all, and there's been very little sporting infrastructure around football. One of the things that the model picks up is that for two countries with the same amount of players, the one with a bigger population tends to do worse because football's clearly a lower priority. What it needs to do if it wants to if it wants to achieve Xi Jinping's dream of being a world football superpower, is it needs to get more people playing from a very young age and crucially get them playing creatively.
And I don't suppose the model helps you predict who's actually going to win in Russia.
So unfortunately, it's only backwards looking, but it does think that Germany ought to dominate football in the long term. And I would say it's pretty neck and neck between Germany and Brazil for the tournament. But one of the brilliant things is that anyone can win it. The other thing that the numbers show is that there ought to have been more fairy tale runs like South Korea's in 2002. So don't be surprised if an underdog, that my personal pick would be Peru, who I think many people are underrating, who've done a brilliant job in South America.
Well, it is, after all, a game of two halves. James, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of The Week Ahead. If you like our journalism, please subscribe at economist.com/radio offer for 12 issues for $12 or £12. I'm Daniel Franklin. In London, this is The Economist.
Hi, this is Erin McCann, the Deputy Politics Editor at The New York Times. Right now around the country, you're probably hearing conversations about issues that affect us all. Immigration, the Second Amendment, sexual harassment, just to name a few. That's why our focus at The Times is on reporting the facts and the issues that matter most to help you understand what's at stake for your community, for your state, and for your country. The truth demands our attention. Read, watch, and listen to The New York Times. Visit nytimes.com/truth.